Scott is a proud sponsor of the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. Scott Ceramic Products has been manufacturing equipment for potters since 1953. Scott's reputation as a pioneer in innovative kiln design continues with the fourth generation of this family-owned business. Their KilnMaster touchscreen controller offers a sleek, smartphone-like interface that is both intuitive and packed with powerful tools that allow potters to easily program, diagnose, and remotely monitor their kilns. With 5 dedicated kiln technicians on staff and the most comprehensive network of distributors across the globe, you can rest assured that Scott will be there for you before and after the sale. For more information on their line of kilns, visit scott.com. This episode is also sponsored by the Poquoson Art School of Fine Craft. Poquoson is a full-service art center located in Columbia, North Carolina, offering interactive online workshops as well as a 5-month spring residency where you can focus on your creative practice. They invite you to register for their annual online benefit auction happening October the 16th through the 23rd. To learn more about these opportunities, visit poquosonarts.org. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 394 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm welcoming back one of my favorite guests, Walter Ostrom, to talk about a new retrospective book about his career. In this interview, we talk about his early project-based work, as well as the questions that motivated his decades-long studio practice. One of the things I love about this book is that you get to look behind the ceramics career to his bigger life. And one of the things we talk about is his love of crossbreeding rhododendron. He's been involved with that for many decades and other gardening projects, and I think it shows his ongoing determination to slowly craft something over a long amount of time. If you'd like to get a copy of The Good Earth, The Pots and Passion of Walter Ostrom, you can find that wherever fine books are sold. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to thank the folks that make this show possible. I'd like to thank Rebecca Stansberry and Catherine Smith for their recent contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do that at the website. That's talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. One of the things that I've loved about this book is that I've gotten to know specific pieces of your work in the past that I just didn't know about. So there's a lot of the early work that was project-based, and I thought we would actually start with that. And there's a piece that I've seen referenced in different names, but essentially you took little bits of clay, marine clay from your area, and you sent it to artists all over the world, and you asked them to do something with it. So can you talk about a project like that? Like, what was the idea behind that?
Those were the days when NASCAT, the school, was probably the hippest, best art school in the world. So a lot of, the activity was essentially trying to undermine the established art system. So one thing that was big, and we even had a gallery, which had to do with postcards. There was Xerox machines, and there were, like books and pamphlets. So that was the media. So the students, there was 8 or 9 students and myself. We thought about doing something, along that line, and Well, actually, I think the reason how it actually happened, I'm not really sure, but something came up with what would other people do with this clay. So we sent 100 grams of that powdered clay, and the students provided the names. Okay, so you get people like Sergi Hamada, Bernard Leach, Peter Volkas, etc., and then Joseph Gasuth, and then Betsy May Ross from down the road. You get this whole mixture. So whatever they sent back to us, and we really got a lot of stuff back. If it was an object, we photographed it. And of course, even if it was a written thing, we photographed that too. And then we put it together and stapled it. So in other words, it was very simple production. And it really was, the more I think about it, the more interesting a project I think it was. I mean, you had the romance of Peter Volkas. I mean, I was impressed that he would even respond, but his romantic notion that they had a flood, it went back into the ocean, it's going to come back to the Atlantic Ocean provinces and be, settled again in Nova Scotia. I mean, that's pretty romantic. And then we had Bernard Leach, who was, we got a secretary who just said, I'm sorry, Bernard Leach is so busy, he really doesn't have time for this project. And so Hamada says, I'm the niece and the only one who can write English. So Hamada is so disappointed. He feels so bad. He's just really, really upset that he could not involve himself in this fabulous, wonderful project that you are doing there in Canada. Do you see how interesting? I mean, just how people responded, their tone told us something. And then we got some really interesting things. I mean, there's the James Melchert thing, where he folded graph paper, put the dry clay on it, and then tapped it underneath, and got these really interesting kind of, well, I'd call them sort of like drawings. So he sent those to us as a visual piece. Jerry Ferguson did a similar thing. He threw the clay on a piece of canvas and then, sprayed black lacquer on it, et cetera, et cetera. And then he gives you can tell he's a teacher because he gives an excellent analysis of what the piece means, in terms of Marshall McLuhan, the media is the message. So it was really good. It was good, but the students thought it was so crazy.
Well, this was in the 60s, the late 60s, which is interesting to think about. Now, social practice is a term that you hear talked about in the art world. Like, there are a lot of artists that are essentially doing what you're doing, but instead of sending clay, they're, sending projects out in which they're engaging the public, and then the public is part of the art piece. But you did this 45, 50 years before it became the thing to do.
Yeah, actually, it was 1970.
70. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know people were doing that.
It's a huge movement now, social practice-oriented art, which I started to see in maybe the mid-2010s. This was something that people's whole practice was that they were making objects, sending them out into the world, and then the response back was the art.
Is that not typical? That what is kind of radical art at one time is new, and about 20 years later, the academics, or the 30 years later, it becomes part of the popular culture. So, and no doubt they probably got some wonderful things, and it took them to another plane of understanding. Like, I don't want to sound like, oh, gee, they're Johnny-come-latelys. I mean, I still think there's value in doing things like that. Except I want to see what you're doing. I want to see what Well, if he wasn't dead, so do you matter. But, that's what I would find. I'd like to see what Garth Clark would do with it.
Well, there's a couple other projects from this era that I also didn't know about. That there was a computer program that you wrote with someone else that would analyze all the different possible chemistry combinations of glaze. And I think it was like 11,000. You guys came up with 11,000 recipes.
That was only between cone, I think, 8 and 12 or 10 and 12. I mean, I was going to try to do it for all the glazes. But as it was, we can't, because those were the days of paper printout. As it was about 8 inches thick. But then what I did was we printed it out, and then they put it was in a couple of magazines, and I think in some newspapers who did it for free, send your name and self-addressed envelope or something, and we'll send you some good glazes. And if possible, we would like to see, your result. And the most involved people were the people in Holland. And there's just a little tiny picture. I just really wished we had the photos, because they sent us all these photos. They did a whole show of it. And, they were really, really into it. And it was wonderful to see how this printout nebulous thing, turned into these wonderful diagrams and wonderful text, So that was fun.
Well, the interesting thing about that project is that you're putting all these possibilities on paper. But as artists, we take possibilities and we make them concrete through making objects out of them. So it was interesting to know that was something in your early career that it was not object-based. I mean, there was the book and the printout, but it was not an object you were making. It was basically using a computer to show, here's the mathematical possibilities of all these things. And I think that in a way is a platform for the way you approached object making, is that I'm going to put a bunch of things together and test all these variables and then see what happens. So can you talk about how those early projects set a way for you to think about research? Because they are research in a way.
As far as that piece goes, the way I see it was, at that time, I kind of had this revelation or somebody told me, and it made really sense. I think it was just actually a movement. Art is information. Right? And so that piece was, in this writing, the computer printout is information in a way as we know it, right? These chemical relationships. In a way, you didn't even have to make it, because here it was already done. So it really had more relationship to Joseph Cassou's work than maybe Duchamp or somebody like that. Tell me again what your second question is.
About research, because these early projects, I know you were making objects regularly at that point as well. This was, these projects were on the side, but they're research oriented. You were using your previous background in science and applying this research methodology to clay. So did that inform the way you did research after that, going forward in your studio making things?
No. As I said, I was a closet potter. I really was collecting things on the side, and I just never could stop loving ceramics. I mean, pottery. It's like short circuit in my brain. And I got to justify really dealing with it in school, in the curriculum, in the class, by saying, well, students can't really understand the abstraction of some of the things that we're doing if they don't know about the material, if they don't know about the pottery traditions, sculptural traditions, et cetera, et cetera. So then that just gave me permission to put the wheels back into the classroom and give them, okay, let's do 100 cylinders for next week.
And that foundation of skill, I feel like, is such a great way for students to understand the history of clay as they work with it themselves. But it's also a really great way for them to understand themselves, because they're sitting at the wheel working. I mean, working always creates understanding, whether that's of yourself as the artist or the object you make. It's kind of toss up which one is going to be the revelation for the person.
Right. If I understand you right, you're talking about working as learning.
Yes.
I totally believe in that, as long as the person is engaged. Because I've also seen people make 100 dumb cylinders, like garbage cylinders. I mean, they might have looked up, but they were thinking about going to the dance or the rave or, whatever. They weren't really engaged. And I think if you work on the wheel, especially, it will show in the final piece how engaged you were in making it. Do you know? I mean, you see so many millions of pieces of pottery in Japan that those people are so disengaged, even though it's handmade. It's not funny. I mean, they're still nice little objects, but you know what I mean? They're not. It's almost as if human hands never touched them.
Well, I want to go back to one more piece from the 70s, and then we'll move forward. You made this piece, flower pots you put into a large house that you built, or wooden shed that you built in a gallery.
Oh, yeah, that's shed. Tell me shed. That's a lath house. Oh, my God.
Lath house. I'm so sorry.
And they're a beautiful structure, and my father, and did Hub help me too?
Yeah.
My father and my neighbor built that. This gallery was like a canyon. It really had been built for color field paintings. Remember the paintings that are 12 by 20 feet? Okay. So my little pots just were lost in this huge space. So my mentor, Jerry Ferguson, said, well, you got to bring it down. So we built the lath house. And the lath house was something that's already in my life, because it's where you grow tender plants, where you protect them, where you encourage them to grow. But this looks so beautiful because it's brand new spruce lumber with a parquet floor, and here's a building. And then at the other end, I had something else. But because that show, what I was making then was flower pots. And this is, after I made that decision of, rather than using the ceramic supermarket and, working with English clay in my studio, which I still got, what's already there? What am I sitting on? And I had a pair of students actually, push that and set up a great studio, Birdsville, Worthington. And they went to the brick company and, got clay, and they made a whole life with slip, decorated earthenware. So anyway, I got it, and I said to myself, well, actually, people gave it to me. I said, what's appropriate? What do you make from earthenware, right? Flower pots. I mean, that was my experience. Every earthenware piece I had around me was a flower pot. So I started to make flower pots, and then, that got me into like terracage and, et cetera, et cetera. And then I got involved with putting white slip, which just grows and grows.
In the lath house, the idea of being inside of a structure in another structure is interesting, because a lot of times I think we go into the gallery and we want to stand far back from the work, at least the large color field paintings. So by making this house within a house, the person's proximity to all the pots you made, I would imagine, shrunk so that they could feel like, hey, this is home. I mean, not that people live in a lath house, but it feels more domestic or more private than a big gallery space.
Right. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about that, for years, that people in Halifax would joke, because we're such a hip school, that the potter did the first installation piece. So there was a kind of irony there, but in another way, it was true. But the other thing that was so wonderful about that show, it's like snowing and terrible, the weather. Well, I had made arrangements with the agriculture station to force these big azaleas and plants, so they were in the gallery, smelled like spring. I mean, it was just a very up kind of experience.
Yeah, and it seemed to me like that show was also about starting at the beginning. Not that was the beginning of your career, but like this is the beginning of pottery, like saying like this is a utilitarian flower pot. It is not a fancy pedestal pot. Like this is about life, real life, and I'm going to put it in the gallery, which seems like a foundation that you built on later as you made functional pots that became, that kind of blended the conceptual decoration with utilitarian pots.
Yeah, well, that was the next step. Utility as, what would you say, stereotype pots, to, making things for us to cook in. I mean, it's just another step up in a way, which was just a giant, giant world. I mean, flower pots are not that giant. They are giant, but, functional utilitarian ceramics is like, you can't limit it, really.
Well, I want to take a detour and talk about your time in China, because around this time, in 1976, you went to China. And when I read that in the book, I could not believe it was 1976. Like, this was not long, like this was in right after the Mao era. So how did you end up going?
Well, we had, what was wonderful, we had a faculty member at another, Halifax has like 6 universities, and she was very connected to the Chinese government. Okay, and she taught Chinese history and whatnot there. And I asked her to come to because I was teaching Oriental art history, and I would ask her to come and give talks on the context, of the history and whatever of these different periods. And so we became good friends. Then she got the permission from the Chinese embassy to bring 21 or 22 students to China. And so she asked if I would be one. And I just thought, this is, obviously came from heaven. And I left for China the day after the show opened. That show we were just talking about. So you want to talk about somebody who was like 6 feet off the ground. And it was unbelievable there, because it still was, the Cultural Revolution was still alive. It was running out, but, we couldn't have, weren't supposed to have Pepsi, and we were supposed to take tape and put it over if our camera said Taiwan or, that kind of thing. And we had minders. We had 2 guides, and then we had minders that would give us, we would have a little red book, struggle meeting in the morning on the bus. And I loved it. Oh, it was amazing. And we were there for a long time. We saw so much of China, but they wouldn't take me to a pottery.
Huh.
So finally, they took me to see ceramics. It was in Liling, where it's a great, great museum there now. And it was a factory, because they had also caught me sneaking out and buying these little handmade pots, which the Chinese accused me of collecting backwoods phenomena. to take back to Canada and the States and say, see how the Chinese make pottery. Do you see? So they took me to the factory to show me how sophisticated, and this is how pottery is made in China. It was really interesting because I was the center of a struggle meeting because of my collection of backwoods phenomena. But I used my little red book. I found a passage from Mao in there that got me off the hook.
And for people that don't know, the Little Red Book was a collection of Mao's writings that was often carried around and referenced. As you mentioned, the minders had it on them. It was something that the Chinese population, anyone at that era would have known this book. And actually, if you go to the Propaganda History Museum in Shanghai, you can see those little red books.
That red book was almost a talisman, like it was more than the minders. Many of the just citizenry carried that book. It was really, really important. And again, not to be forgotten is how Mao lifted the Chinese lives, their living conditions. I mean, it was miracle. He was also caused some absolutely horrible things to happen as well. But at the end of it, after Deng Xiaoping took over, he kind of rectified, the situation.
In the chronology of this is you going in 76 and seeing the Cultural Revolution and then coming back to a Canadian university as an American and then teaching and then later making political work. Like you saw firsthand what people talked about the ills of communism, but you saw that it was not all ills, that this was just another system of thinking. Did that experience of being in a different political system, different language base, all these, basically being an outsider, how did that affect your teaching when you got back to the students?
I always had a political sort of bent or interest. And when I was in university, I was like an SDS and ban the bomb and anti-HUAC and all those kinds of things. And in fact, I always loved China, so I would read what was going on in China. Mostly it came from the New York Review of Books, which was incredibly left-wing in those days. They wrote such glowing things about China. And that was one of the things actually that shook me up is when I actually got there. It was, you could really feel the sort of control, even the social control. You better not say. And when I talked to people, you could tell they would be guarded, in their conversation. So in that sense, it helped me realize that it was a complex thing, the revolution. And, we can see, and then how it played out with Deng Xiaoping. And now we can see things have changed super radically again. But my interest in China tends to be more historical and especially in ceramics, Chinese context. So it's politics. It's not the, I can kind of roll with it. I mean, I don't have an ideology that I want to impose so in other words, it's kind of a secondary thing, which is also good for me because I've been up there so many times. I could have been there on the wrong side of the track, right? I mean, one of those, it wouldn't have worked out.
Well, that was the same experience that I went when I told my dad that I was moving to China. in the early 2010s, he stayed up all night. He was so scared that I was moving to a communist country. And when I got there, I would just write him emails like, Dad, you don't understand this. Like, this is fine. You know?
Right. By 2010, you were drinking Coca-Cola.
Oh, yeah. And
they were selling it.
Yeah, it was a completely different experience. And this is a good segue to your time that you spent teaching in Jingdezhen at the Ceramic Institute, which I think was 95, 96, somewhere in there. You did a year-long sabbatical or a year-long placement there?
Or was it in the 80s?
Oh, was it in the 80s? Okay.
I don't know, maybe the 90s. I have trouble with time. It seems like my whole career at teaching and making pots is really like 10 years.
Yeah,
and I mean, it kind of went so fast, right? But no, that was so fabulous at working at the Institute.
Well, one of the things in the book that I thought was so funny is someone told this story that you brought slides with you, like literal slides, like images on slides of ceramic history, that you wanted to bring those with you to show at the students that you were teaching. So why did you find it was important to bring this ceramic information with you when you took this job for a year?
Well, first off, I knew that ceramic students never know their own history. They don't. They're ignorant. And the Chinese, maybe one or two of because the whole school would show up for these lectures. It was brand new to them. It's just law or just reality. And I, of course, felt it my duty to tell them something about their own culture. And I think maybe it made it even special for them because it was coming from somebody who admired and respected Chinese culture.
And so I think in the book it said you brought 500 slides, which is like you brought a ceramic history collection with you in images and took it across the world with you.
Yeah, it did. Because I also had, my earthenware and I had my Mayalika things. Like, that was wonderful. It's to show like the Chinese, the Mayalika stuff. First of all, in China, if you work with earthenware, at least it used to be, you weren't classified as a potter. Okay? It was that like you made kind of flower pots and bricks. That was not even, I mean, that's how the hierarchy of my materials went. So then when I showed them Mayalika, it was difficult for them to understand why they just didn't have porcelain, that everybody has it. But so then they really admired, I think, how technically the Italians developed it, because those really incredible trompe-l'oeil plates, I mean, amazingly sophisticated painting on would impress anybody.
Let's back up from that teaching experience. And I want to think broadly about when you introduce tradition to students and whether that becomes a burden for them as young makers or whether that becomes something that can give them momentum.
First of all, if it became a burden for them, they should not be in my class. Okay? Because the two things I value the most are curiosity and work habits. What it does, well, here's an analogy. Let's say you're a painting or a sculptor, and you go to art school. Well, they get 4 years of context for painting. 4 years. The reason I got so into the history business is because I got sorry. Well, I got nothing from. Even in graduate school, I would have to pick because I minored in art history. I only picked those countries that had some kind of ceramic tradition so I could write a paper, on that. And I see it in the students over and over and over again. So I have no problem with it. How it opens their eyes, how they get to see pots, how they get to see the information that's in there, how they get to see themselves. They, most students don't even see themselves in their work. It's hard, even for me. I mean, it's usually somebody, some critic or some friend saying, "Oh, Walter, what about that?" I'm saying, that's something I never realized. And there's so much to learn in there. Like, you look at a different lip, you see feet that you couldn't even dream about here. Do you know that how another person solved that problem, or a handle, or I don't know. It's so rich with, let's say, job, like we're potters, a job, we're learning new things, on that level in the studio, to learning about the context. Why does the Sung Dynasty pot look the way it does? Why does it differ from the Tang Dynasty, which is like 200 years earlier? Then why, again, does it look like, why do these things change? That brings out, you realize, and this is a favorite line, a pot is a container of cultural, social, religious, add a whole bunch of things, information. It holds it. And it's true. It holds more. What else holds that much? Some kind of painting that could get moldy or burn up, or, it's there.
It's funny you say that about paintings, because one of the things that makes pottery such a good teaching tool is it is so damn durable. You can find these pots from thousands of years ago and then work backwards to the people that made them to try to understand better. But one of the things that happens is that we're always putting our context today and our beliefs today on what we think those people meant back then. So as a teacher of ceramic history, how did you teach the students that, yes, this is the academic opinion of what these times were like, but we don't really know. And maybe this is why they did it, and maybe they didn't do it like this.
Well, we know about 90%, okay, because there's history, and people have spent great hundreds of years, millions of hours studying this. It's just so happens it was never condensed and given to us. You know what I mean? Again, sure. Context. The biggest limitation that we have, I think, as artists, or especially as potters, is we see the world this way. Okay? We see the world through very, very limited perspective. Example, and it's reinforced by, how the larger world. For instance, you go into, and this happened to me actually, the Yangshao pots, and they're from Chinese Neolithic, and they go like this, and they have these two lugs there with a thing. And I can remember we used to talk, they must have put sticks through them and carried them and whatever. And I was at the ROM in their, warehouse there with Patty Proctor. And she said, Walter, we were talking about Yangshao. So she said, would you bring that pot over there? So I went over, I leaned over, and my fingers went automatically into those loops. But the other thing that was more important was that this decoration, this spiral, this whatnot, when you look down on it and plan, it was totally different. And then you realize when we go into the museum, they have those pots in cases. They were never looked at that way. They weren't made to look at that way. Do you see? But our culture says, well, pottery goes on shelves. That's a case where I think the best intentions, how culture, or our culture, society, whatever, gives us false news. Is that right? False news?
Fake news, yes. Fake news.
Fake news, yes.
No, but I think you're right. Like if you live with that pot and you're in close proximity with the pot, then of course it feels and appears different than it does in a picture, which is the other thing I think that is really valuable to teach or to be able to get students into the backsides of museums so they can see these pots in the round, not behind the glass case.
Oh, yeah. And especially, I mean, the Freer Gallery in Washington is so wonderful. Marty Amp ran it when I take our students down there. They have the cork table. They give you gloves. They tell you always 2 hands, never touch a handle or a spout, and never let it be more than 6 inches above the table. I've had some really direct experiences from actually being there and being allowed to do that, but it's so great for the kids because they get to feel the weight. They think, oh, wow, this guy his throwing wasn't any better than mine. It's just like so heavy, And then other people say, oh my God, who made this? This is like made of, so they can kind of start relating to it. That's them. They're part of that.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the way you've directed yourself in your studio over the years. I want people to get the book, and this is a book that is a retrospective of your work. It's called Good Earth, The Pots and Passion of Walter Ostrom, and they'll be able to see a lot of the art that we're talking about. But I wanted to think broadly about how you sort of structure your thoughts in your own studio. And this comes from a lecture you gave at the MIA in Minneapolis. It was your Regis lecture for an award you were given. And these are questions that you ask yourself. And you have this whole list of questions you ask yourself. One of them is, what does it mean? Which I can relate to that. Trying to understand what does an object mean. What is appropriate, which I thought was also interesting. What if? Meaning like, what are the possibilities? And then one of the things you had on the list was not a question. It was just challenge modernism. So could you talk to me about those questions and also why challenging modernism is important in your own studio practice?
Okay. This is a war. Okay. Think before modernism. So we're talking about 19th century or something. What was a dinner service? How many pieces was in a dinner service? Each person got like 10 plates. They had a fish plate. They had pheasant plate. They had a salmon plate. They had this, whatever. And then they had these shelves and consoles where they would show those things. Along comes modernism, and they say, well, the first thing they say is we got to change the houses. We got to make them smaller. We got to make the ceiling smaller, get everything kind of compressed. And the big thing that affects ceramics is the notion of home ec. Home economics is death. Because what they said, the kitchen has to be a kind of a fake laboratory. It should kind of even look countertops, like a lab. And as we know, labs are full of cupboards. So you're not going to put all that stuff in. You can make the ugliest thing in the world, and you're going to stick it in the cupboard when you're finished. And also, you can't have that many cupboards. So our 20 setting, 18-piece setting comes down to salad, dessert, a side plate that could also be as a luncheon plate, the dinner plate, and a cereal bowl. Do you see? So, and they all got to be stackable, right? So all these parameters, and that's like modernism. Less is more, right? Whereas I believe more is more. And, that line I got from Wayne Higby. And because, he's really, really a good thinker. But do you see how that had that terrible or that incredible effect on just ceramics the variety of the things that would be made. And then, of course, in what becomes almost fetishized is Oriental, Japanese, Chinese ceramics, because they're so simple, right? And they're true to materials. We all know clay is brown, and am I so dumb? I don't know that. I mean, it's like every piece is telling me the same freaking thing, that it's being true to materials. Give me some mayalika, like lighten it up a little bit. So, and that's part of the modernist movement. And that's what gives us Bernard Leach, and who's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It really bothers me to hear him being criticized so much. And when I was younger, he was like dealt with as a terrible bad influence. Hopefully we're over that now. But anyway, that's all modernism. And so that's just pottery. You can look at a lot of, what do they call that architecture that the Soviet Union made?
Oh, brutalist.
Brutalist. Well, you look around North America, you see so much brutalist architecture that's still left. And that was modern.
And God, especially in schools. Like as I go around and lecture and teach at schools, it is a brutalist nightmare to walk around most college campuses. It's always disappointing, especially when the art school is brutalist architecture.
Yeah. I mean, it's the nicest art school, I think, although really it's kind of stereotypical, so it's not that funny. But in Australia, their art school is a 19th century mental institution. So it's, thick, Victorian, neo-Gothic. It's got all that kind of scary stuff about it. But the only problem with it was when I was in there, all I could do is think of the screams that were in those stone walls. But probably, I mean, I was there for a week. If I worked there, I'd probably get over that. But
it's
anyway.
So funny you mentioned that, because I that's the art school in Sydney, and I remember thinking the windows were really small.
Yeah.
And that the students, when I was there, were all outside on the lawn. So if they weren't in class, they were like, okay, we got to get out of here. And they were all outside having lunch on the lawn.
Yes. Interesting.
Well, when I think about this way you've guided yourself, though, the thing that's interesting is you have these questions you've answered yourself, but then the objects you make or have made over, 50 plus years all look so different. Like it was amazing to see the variety of aesthetics and decoration that came out of your mind and hands over this time. So can you talk about how asking yourself those questions got to Mayalika work, got to slipware work, got to sculptural vessels, using
salt glaze?
Exactly. Like there's so many different iterations.
Well, I think I kind of, rolled with the punches. We had a student who came, this is before I'd worked with salt glaze, and someplace in Pennsylvania. Anyway, he just built a salt kiln there. So he built one at the art school, and then he transferred to sculpture, and, I don't know what he's doing now, but we had a salt kiln. So we really got into that, and that was really, it was new and exciting and whatever. And then we got, and out of that came exploration of the native clays. Like Nova Scotia has about 6, 7, 8 fabulous native clays. It even has a pure kaolin that the paper companies started to develop, instead of using the North Carolina kaolin. Anyway, so we're playing with that. Raku, of course, we did inside the school. Nobody, in those days, the smoke just rolled up the stairways. And they thought we were like smoking herring down in the pottery studio. And then, so then I started somebody gave me the earthenware clay as you better do something with this. It was a group I used to do workshops for, and they all used their local earthenware. And all of them had, because they had to dig it, dry it out, they had those old wash machines, that go like this, the tub washers. Mm-hmm. And that's what they used for blungers. I mean, it's so cool. So anyway, I would go there and give them hours of lectures on Chinese ceramics and modernist, whatever. And then they finally said to me, Walter, you give us all this stuff. Have you ever tried our clay? Have you ever tried the earthenware? I said, no. They said, well, we really would, other words, I can't believe I was so rude that I'd never done that. So put the clay in the thing, and I'm thinking in my mind, now what should I make? What should I make? What's appropriate in the earthenware? Flower pot. And I was amazed at that clay. I was amazed because it was like right out of the ground. So it meant it still was incredibly fine. Every particle was totally hydrated. It was like silk.
Oh, wow.
Then I took it home and I had it there. And then I was thinking more and more, about, again, how technologies are generated locally. Faenza has this great earthenware, and it goes to Jing and whatnot, and porcelain. And it was just, and I contrasted that with our world of supermarket, of clay and product, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But could you imagine if I was let loose in that supermarket? I would never make the same thing twice. I would go nuts. So this was a way also of establishing some parameters for me, learning more about the province that I went to, because it's an incredible rich history here. And I was fortunate the senior man was someone who grew up there and done ceramics there. So he knew everyone and he knew the geology. So it was exciting from that point as well.
Yeah, I like that you talk about the the local clay was parameters. Like it gave you kind of a box to work within, because then you got to push against it. And I think that seems to be a part of your working method, is just question everything. Like, why does it have to be like this? But at least if you have something to question, it gives you somewhere to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I usually have a rough idea of what I want to do. And as soon as I start doing it, it generates, I think like your art comes from art, or your pots come from pots. I mean, and that's something that happens once you get started. The only danger with this theory is people who are learning how to throw start with a big bowl and then up with an ashtray. And they say that's what it was all the time. You know what I mean? You can't fall into that trap.
Yeah.
You got to stick to, essentially your ideas. But your ideas are so fluid. When we talk about stuff, you and I can talk about a piece. And in our minds, we're thinking two different things. You know what I mean? You have to see it. And it's the same way when you're working. So in other words, just working generated a lot of questions, for me, especially like, how could I be so clumsy when I'm a professor of art? It's like my wife said, when I was really nuts about Mayelica and whatever, in those days, we had to mix up all the colors and, so I had like 60 bottles all crusty and whatnot of different colors. And to to decorate. And my wife would come into my studio and she said, Walter, you really amaze me. I can't believe it. There you got over 50 colors. And you picked the only 2 ugly ones on that table. How do you do it? Professor of art. I mean, I never felt that, professor of art business. I just felt that I made stuff. We were interested in stuff. If I had more information than you, then I would share it. It wasn't kind of about that. And we had kids that, especially in the beginning, when we didn't know how to make a leadless glaze, because all the glazes were lead, right? So my glaze chemistry class turned into how do we develop a leadless glaze, more importantly, that is good for color. Because you see, you can always get a leadless glaze with, what do they call that? The other word for grizzly berry.
Right.
But it kills color, right? It's just a real color killer. Historically, who did it? Who did great color with it?
Yeah, Middle East for sure.
The soda glaze is from the Middle East, so that helped a little bit, history. And it helped us start to put, using like Fritz 3110, which is like very alkaline, but grazes like crazy. But it started to help us formulate and work out some of these glazes. And then we'd get some great glazes too from other people who were working. Because there were people, around the U.S., I don't know in Canada, but there were people around the U.S. who dared to kind of work in earthenware. Often, when you went for workshops, it was because a group of students who really wanted to learn about it, kind of forced the faculty to invite. So the first thing you get in there is this warning: don't touch anything. That's the earthenware part of the room. You're going to contaminate everything else. You're going to contaminate it. Oh, it's such baloney. I would think maybe if it contaminated what you're making, it might give your thing a little life. But it was really interesting, like how naive, people were to think you can only have 1 clay or 2 clays in the studio. So I guess that was my missionary days.
Well, I always say that all terracotta roads lead back to your studio in Northern America, because so many makers have either worked with you and then gone out, or, for instance, my teacher, Linda Arbuckle, had learned from you and then taught me. So there's this transmission of terracotta information that's trickled down over the years. But I wanted to wrap up talking about gardening, because that was one thing I really enjoyed in the book, was reading about your exploration and hybridization of rhododendrons, which I just didn't know that. I mean, I've been to your house in Lunenburg and I've seen your gardens, but I didn't understand that was a parallel path for you, that you were actually developing new or refining species of rhododendron. So can you talk about that? You're interested in that specific type of plant?
When I grew up in a kind of upstate New York on the poorer side of town. And on the nicer side of town, people had rhododendrons, okay? And I always worked in the garden, even when I was small. To be banned to the garden to pull weeds, that never bothered me. I don't know why, but it did. So anyway, here are these beautiful, they're beautiful. And in the winter, they're still green in the shape of the leaves and whatnot. So I always thought they were pretty interesting. Sorry. And most of them, come from Asia, China, and Japan. When I moved to Nova Scotia, I joined this, there was like 6 people in those days, a naturalist club. And we went on a little walk and they said, that's Rhododendron canadense. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was deciduous. It's a very delicate, elegant little plant. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a poem that's called Rhododendron. So anyway, here's this. I just go, oh my God, this plant's here. I need to know more about it. So I write to the American Rhododendron Society, because they had a nice magazine and everything. And they say, why are you contacting us? One of the world's experts lives in Nova Scotia. So I caught up with him, and he changed my life. And I think you see, so there is those issues of you get a beautiful plant that's just not hardy for your area, but it is possible to breed it with another one, etc. So in college, I had taken genetics. And so kind of like Glaze chemistry, it's pretty simple if you've already done 3 years of chemistry. I mean, plant genetics is not quite as simple as that, but you can still get it fairly quick. And what's wonderful, you send to London, or you send to Lord Rothschild, his estate, that you want pollen from one of his plants as hybrids. Somebody sends it, puts it in an envelope, sends it over, and you put the pollen on it, because you're the bee. Essentially you're the bee. And then you get these plants. You got to have patience. That's what it taught me. You wait 8 to 10 years till they bloom. Well, usually the first crosses aren't that bad. So you back cross it, wait another 8 to 10 years, and see what you got. And you may come up with a bunch of dogs, or you may come up with fabulous flowers, but the plant looks, kind of like
gnarly,
like a spider. Or you come up with unbelievably gorgeous foliage, just so beautiful, but with like some nasty little flowers. But that didn't bother me, because I just went around and picked those little buds off. So I didn't have to see that. And of course, I never realized it, but you see, that's how John Gill, he's the first one who said to me, Walter, because he's like so insightful. He said, it's like your plants, you're hybridizing, you're a little bee, you go to this French 17th century ormolu and then you buzz over to 6th century Japan, and then you put in some politics and whatever. So I think that's an interesting parallel, thinking of a lot of stuff.
Well, I like that that essay appears later in the book. So it is a way of after reading about your experience gardening, I understood your pots better. And I think, like John Gill said, your tendency to hybridize information, that is just a part of your brain. And that is something that I think is also a part of postmodernism. Like, this is the approach. Right. So that seems to be the approach of mixing and matching and blending is something that we commonly do. But then I want to bring back the question, what does it mean?
The big question.
Yes. So let's talk about that. When you look at postmodern ceramics that blend all these different influences, whether you made it or other people, how do you think we determine from our context today what these things mean?
Well, the first thing I think in terms of POMO, if you're thinking that way, then you are working within a postmodern framework, ideology, whatever. But I don't think that way. Like, this is this, that's that, this is that. And I'm not thinking, I need, some 10th century Juan glaze here or some whatnot. I mean, I work along, and I'll tell you again, I was so lucky to have met certain people in my life, because you can see, the what if, that drives me crazy. I could never make up my mind. What if I did this blue? What if I do this, right? And I might spend 3 hours trying to figure out how to decorate this pot. So John Gill gave me great method. You write down, okay, I'll do it this way or that way, and flip a coin. Okay? And you know what he said? That way, at least 50% of the time, you'll do something you wouldn't normally do. You see, because we always go with what we know. So that, I think, was great, the information. And then on the other problem that I had for a long, long time is over-intellectualizing the work, especially when I was, kind of like making it, and it's like here, or I got it made, and it doesn't mean this, doesn't mean whoa. So Wayne said to me, Walter, instead of figuring out the work, not dissemble, but deconstruct your piece, just go by feel. Like, how does this feel? How about if you do it this way? How does that feel? And I can't say that that's become a way of my way of thinking, but it really, really helped me to counteract this over-intellectualization, which has been a problem. Because anyway. But I think I escaped it maybe 20 years ago. Because the way I see things is that you make something and you've got all this information in it, okay? And the Song Dynasty, France, whatever, the local clay. But the great thing about utilitarian pottery is that if it works, that's, if it does its job, it's a success. Now, all that other information that's in there and makes it look kind of what it is, to see that depends on the eye of the viewer or the user, right? A rose is a rose is a rose. If you know something about ceramic history, there's something about China or something about the Near East or whatever, you'll connect with that. But you don't need to know all that sort of thing to appreciate it, because at the very, very least, it keeps the food off the tablecloth. It's always useful. But you see, all that other information is in there. And also makes a good, the soap dishes, Lady Macbeth soap dishes, about washing your hands, of the axis of evil and the treatment of the Palestinians. What that also demonstrates, a soap dish, ceramics, is acceptable to people. It's like if I have a big sign, and often people don't go into galleries because they think, I won't understand what's in there. I'm uncomfortable, so they don't. But people will always deal with a piece of ceramics because they've touched it and used it and lived with it all their lives. So it is a good way to subvert society without smacking them in the face.
I love the Lady Macbeth soap dishes, and you talked about, or someone referenced in the book, that you said it wasn't effective to put a big sign on a plate that says "Don't drop the bomb," because people would be like, "What?" Like they just would disagree with it immediately or overlook it. But when you make this soap dish about the invasion of Iraq or the treatment of Palestinians, it's a subtle physical action that the pot allows them to do that will help them question what they think about the idea that's on the surface.
And it's perfect for me in terms of form and content, because it's a soap dish. It's to wash your hands. Do you know what I mean? It's like, to me, it's just the perfect form and content object. So otherwise, what you could do? I was just thinking, now you raised that. Do you remember your mother saying, "Stop saying that or I'll wash your mouth out with soap"?
Yes.
Well, maybe that could be another series.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. So I wanted to plug the book one more time. It's called Good Earth, The Pots and Passion of Walter Ostrom. And people can get it, I think it's just available at most bookstores, right?
Well, at a lot of bookstores, but it's certainly available, on Amazon. So now we'll say goodbye.
Yes. Okay. Good to see you.
Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye.
You push the button, okay? Because I don't know what. But.
I'd like to thank Walter for taking the time to do this interview. Anytime I get to talk to him, I feel like I always learn so much. So I appreciate his generosity and for him taking the time to chat. I'd like to thank today's sponsor before we go. That is Skutt Ceramic Products. They've been manufacturing equipment for potters since 1953. If you'd like to see their current line of kilns, including their KilnMaster touchscreen controller, visit skutt.com. I'd also like to thank our second sponsor, the Poquoson Art School of Fine Craft. They're getting ready to have their annual online benefit auction happening October the 16th through the 23rd, and you can find out more about how to register for that or the other programs that they have to offer at poquosonarts.org. I am down in Penland, North Carolina, teaching for the next 6 weeks, so I'm going to be releasing episodes every other week until I can get back to the home studio in New Jersey. I hope you guys are all doing well, and as always, thanks for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.